Hello everyone, it's Half-White Mike. I hope you're all doing well. Today we're back with Lord of the Rings Total War Remastered, and I'm doing a faction guide and overview for Dunland. The Dunlendings are the tribes of men we see in the Two Towers films when they ally to Saruman and start raiding the Rohan villages. They don't get a huge amount of airtime in the original films, but in the extended edition we do see the Blood Oath scene in Orthanc, and that's also the intro video for this faction. So the faction starts with 3 settlements just to the west of Isengard. To the north, you've got the Free People's faction, and then to the south, you've got Rohan and also Gondor. I would say this is the one of the hardest factions in the mod, if not the hardest, just because they don't really get elite level troops. Your roster is made up of low to mid tier units, and generally you have to use them until the end. Although, like with most factions, general stacking will give you a bit more power in the late game. Most factions in this mod have rosters which reflect units we see in the films. So, for example, the elves and dwarves don't really have much cavalry, and likewise with the Dunlendings, we don't really see any elite level soldiers in the films, it's more just villagers, so their roster reflects that in a way. The Dunlendings are akin to a barbarian faction in the base game, so generally they are locked to tier 3 when it comes to buildings, and they only get 2 tiers of the wall. So when you combine those points with the relatively weak roster, the campaign can become quite challenging, and mostly you will win just through outnumbering your enemy. In this section, we're going to discuss generals and unique characters. So Dunland starts with 4 generals, which is quite good considering you only have 3 starting settlements. You've got Berthok in the west here, Dara in this settlement, Wolf the faction leader in Dunland, and Karlok in Byreg. So all of your generals have the same model, which is this one here. And they also all share the same bodyguard unit, being the veteran warriors. The stats on this one are a bit inflated by the experience chevron, but if we go to Dara, then we can see the raw stats. So as general's bodyguards go, this is probably one of the weaker ones. The melee attack of 5 is on par with a mid-tier infantry unit from a faction like Gondor, and then the defense of 15 is probably similar. The redeeming feature of this unit is just the fairly high unit size at 120. So most of the forces of good factions have bodyguards around 60. And then when you move on to a faction like the Eastlings, I think they're about 80. But the unit size of 120 is probably its best stat here. Here's a feature of the evil factions. When you come to the Orc nations, their general's bodyguards aren't very good either, but they just have huge numbers, and Dunland is similar in that sense. So not much to speak through in terms of the generals and unique characters, so now I'm going to move on to the economy. In this section, I'm going to run through how the economy works. Dunland are not the best at making money. They lack a lot of the tools that other factions have. The first thing you will note is that we are restricted to tier 3 when it comes to buildings. So if you want to build a tier 4 or tier 5 building, like the slave selection, then you'll need to conquer a settlement which is already a large or huge city, because Dunland can't get there by themselves. They max out at minor city regardless of the population. There are a number of primary revenue streams. You have farms, taxes, trade, and mining income, although mining is not showing up here because we don't have any mines in the settlement. When playing as Dunland, you're not able to build ports, markets, or the conventional farms, which does restrict your trade and farming income. However, what Dunland does have is the slavery building line, which is essentially your market and farm replacement. Now, the benefits from this building depend on the resources in the region in which you build it. So if you build it in a place which doesn't have hidden resource farm, then the first two tiers will just give you a reduction in civil construction cost and also reduce your public order. And then tiers 3 and 4 give you an increase in trade income. Now, trade income is not always that high, and a lot of settlements will be very low. For example, Byrig just has trade income of 26, so it's probably worth just checking what your trade income is before building that, just to make sure that you're getting value for money. If you build the slavery building line in a place like Dunland, which has hidden resource farm, then there are some additional benefits. So the first tier will give you population growth of 0.5% and increased farmland. Then the second tier will give you increased population growth again at 1% and +2 for your farmland. And then tiers 3 and 4 will give you the increase in trade income as we discussed before. So this is your main money-making building, and I would definitely prioritize getting this in places which have hidden resource farm. So I should have explained before, but in order for factions to build farming buildings or their equivalent, a region must have hidden resource farm. And not every region will have that, which is realistic. Not every region in the world would have arable farmland, but the easiest way to check is to use the building browser. So for example, Byrig doesn't have hidden resource farm, so when we go to the building browser, we can't see the farming benefits, but Dunland does have hidden resource farm, so when we click on that in the building browser, then the farming benefits will appear. So it's worth just prioritizing this building in places which has hidden resource farm in order to maximize that farming income. Obviously, it's still worth getting the building if you don't have hidden resource farm, but just bear in mind the increase in, percentage increase in trade income is not always actually that much in reality. So in terms of other ways to generate income, Dunland does get mines. They actually get the full 4 tiers, but you can only get the 4th tier in regions which have mithril, and there's only one place in the world which has that, which is Moria. So in general, you are restricted to the 3 tiers of the mine. So the things to look out for with mines is that if you see a region which has the ore resource, which is a little stone with the orange marking through it, then you can build all 3 tiers. If you see a region which doesn't have the ore, but just has the minerals, then you can only get the 1st tier of the mines. So in general, prioritize those regions which have the full ore resource. And just as a side note, this region is right next to you at the start of the game. It's very accessible. And this is a large town, I believe, so you can get the first 2 tiers of the mine. And bearing in mind, Dunland's not great at making money, this is a good settlement to go for in the early game, just to maximize your income. Other things then, so Dunland doesn't get roads, which is unfortunate, but there's not that much space between the regions in the place where you are, so it's just a minor inconvenience, but it would be nice to have roads. And then lastly, if a region has hidden resource wild men, then your government building will give you a population growth increase, and that reduces as you go up the chain. So the first one gives you 1.5% population growth, the next one gives you 1%, and the last one gives you 0.5%. So it's just a note that if you want to keep your population growth high, then it might be worth staying at a previous tier even when you can upgrade, just to get the added population growth. Because in the long run, getting more population does increase your taxes. And just to reiterate, that is only in regions which have hidden resource wild men, which is generally those sort of across this region, across the central belt, and then also up towards Roscobel. So that's about it for the economy. To be honest, the best way of making money is just to conquer as many regions as you can, because every settlement has a base farm income and tax income, and in the long run that's going to be more beneficial than constructing buildings in existing settlements to increase the income of settlements you already have. And then also going for settlements which have the ore resource is also quite beneficial as well. So with that being said, I'm now going to move on to recruitment. In this section, I'm going to discuss how recruitment works. To do this, I'm using a previous save file for reasons which will hopefully become apparent as we move through. The recruitment system for Dunland is one of the most complex in the game. Their basic roster is quite small, but then they have additional units they can obtain from the military buildings of other factions. So I'm going to start with the standard roster. So if we go to the barracks, there are 3 units we can get. The first tier gives us the warband and the skirmishers, and then the second tier gives us the Dunlanding fighters in addition to the first 2 units there. If you build the barracks in a region which has the horses or lesser horses resource, then it will also give you access to the Dunlanding warhounds. So if we go to Edoras, which has horses and lesser horses, then we can see that the barracks gives us the warhounds as well. Not as useful as cavalry, but a unique unit for this faction. So that's the basic Dunlanding roster. So now let's move on to additional units they can get from the barracks and forge of other nations. The faction you're probably going to be fighting against most is Rohan, given that the victory objectives are essentially to take most of their regions. But if we go to Edoras, for example, which has a tier 2 Rohan forge, then you can see that we can use that forge to recruit the Rohan spear variant of the Dunlandings and also the Rohan axe variant of the Dunlandings. If we go to recruitment here, you'll see the Rohan spears and then the Rohan axe. So essentially, once the other factions have built up their settlements with, the forge and the barracks, then if you conquer them, you can use those military buildings to recruit your units. And that's why I wanted to use a slightly later save file, because at the start of the game, there's not that many regions which will have even tier 1 or tier 1 of the forge or the barracks. So that's basically how the system works. So I'm just going to run through all the units that Dunland can recruit. So as we discussed before, tier 1 of the Rohirrim Armory gives you the Rohan Spear variant, and tier 2 of the Rohirrim Forge gives you the Rohan Axe variant. Moving on to Gondor. The first tier of the Gondor Forge will give you access to the Gondor Spear, which is here. And then the second tier of the Gondor Forge will give you the Gondor Swords. In my opinion, the Gondor variants of the Dunlanding units are the best you have access to, so it's worth trying to pick up a Gondor settlement fairly early on if you can, although you do need to give them enough time to actually build the forge and barracks in the first place. So other units you can get from the forces of good factions are the Elven variants. So I didn't actually conquer Rivendell in this playthrough. I got up to about here by myself, and then I just used console commands for the purpose of this video to show the units. But if we go to Rivendell, then we see that tier 1 of the Forge will gives us access to the Dunlanding Elvish Spear, and tier 2 of the Forge gives us access to the Elvish Sword variant. And you've got a third unit as well, so the Dunlanding Sylvan Blades come from the Elven Barracks. from tier 1 onwards. Fairly strong units, but not as powerful as the Gondor variants. And then there's also some Dwarven variants as well. So likewise, I conquered Erebor with console commands, but we can see that the Dwarven Forge from tier 1 onwards will give us access to the Dwarven Axe variant of the Dunlandings. So that's all the units that you can get from the Forces of Good factions military buildings. There are additional units you can get from the forges and barracks of the factions of evil, but the way the mod is set up, you can't attack a fellow evil faction if you have the diplomacy script turned on. So in most cases you won't be able to get these units, but I have taken control of some settlements just for the purposes of this video to show it. The first thing to note is that two of your starting settlements, Beirig and the settlement in the south, do start with a Isengard Smithy, which gives you access to the Uruk Spear variant of the Dunlandings, and these are really useful because it's the only spear unit you have access to at the start of the game, and you are going to be spending most of your time fighting against Rohan, which are cavalry heavy, so I usually recruit a lot of them from the two starting settlements. But in addition to that, the units you can get from the evil factions military buildings are as follows. So if you conquer somewhere which has a orc spawning pit and doesn't have hidden resource men or goblin, then you'll be able to get some of the orc units. So for example, the orc snagger, lesser orc warband, orc scouts, and the orc archers. If you conquer a region which has hidden resource goblins and has an orc spawning pit, then you'll be able to get some of the goblin units, like the old raider goblins, warrior goblins, and the hunter goblins. But as I said before, it's quite difficult to be in a position where you would ever have a place with a spawning pit unless it was originally owned by an evil faction, taken by a good faction, and then retaken by yourself. There is another Uruk unit you can get from the Isengard Smithy, but it's not possible to upgrade the smithy, so there's no real way to get access to it unless you conquer Isengard, for example, which would have a tier 2 forge. From the Easterling Forge, you can get the Balshot Axe, which is a one-handed axe unit. Outside of that, there are some additional units you can recruit. If a region has a barracks but does not have hidden resource wild men, then you can get some bandit units. Most of the regions which have hidden resource wild men are generally those in this area to the west, down towards here, across the Rohan Gap, and then up towards the north in places like Roscabel. So if a region doesn't have hidden resource wild men, and Helm's Deep is one such example, then you'll see the barracks will give you these bandit spearmen, bandit scouts, and then just a regular bandit unit. They're arguably on par with the standard Dunlanding units, but just wanted to cover these in the recruiting section. But yeah, overall that's how the recruitment system works. I believe the Gondor variants are the best type of Dunlanding units available. And just bear in mind, if you are going after a Gondor settlement in order to use their forge, it has to be tier 2 in order to get the Gondor swords. So if you're heading south, for example, down to one of these settlements, it might not be at the stage where it's got the tier 2 settlement, so just be careful with how early you are going for that. At this stage in the game, 150 turns in, then most places will have their top tier forge, that won't be an issue. But I'm now going to move on to the campaign strategy. So next we move on to my favourite section, the campaign strategy. I will say that this is a very difficult campaign, primarily because of the reasons I mentioned at the start. which is that you just don't have the elite tier units that other factions do. So as you start to move across the map, you will be going against factions that have built themselves up, that do have the elite units, and in a lot of cases upgraded, and it will just become a real struggle to get through them. But having said that, there are a few things you can do to make your life a bit easier. So I'm assuming in the early game you're going to be fighting against Rohan, because the victory objectives are to take most of their settlements. Rohan are obviously quite a cavalry heavy nation, so we need to have as many spear units as possible, and both Byrig and the settlement here have an Isengard smithy, which allows you to recruit the Dunlanding's Uric spear. So straight away I would be recruiting spear units to counter the cavalry of Rohan. Another thing as well is that the Dunlandings don't have cavalry units. You don't have access to wargs either, but in these regions here, sometimes you can pick up cavalry mercenaries. They're called free riders. So if you're ever in this type of vicinity, just click on the Mercs button, and sometimes there'll be a cavalry unit here. Other things to note then against Rohan are usually this is the stage at which it starts to get quite difficult against Rohan. So I'd say what you want to do is head south, take Baldwin and Westmarch, and then you've got a kind of unified front against Rohan. If you take Baldwin and then just head east, then you're going to leave Westmarch and Rohan can just attack you from the west and the south. So you want to take these two regions first so that you've only got this choke point in which to fight Rohan. And this is usually the point at which it gets quite difficult. So there are two places that you can cross the river. One of them is here, and the other one is up here. So if you're ever in a position where Rohan look quite threatening, just plant someone on this river crossing, or up here, and you've got a fairly easy river battle, a river crossing battle, assuming you've got enough spears and skirmishers. And that brings me on to another point actually. I found the most effective army combination was to have a front line of the Uric spears, and then behind that just have a bunch of skirmishers, or the Dunlanding scouts. They don't have a huge amount of ammo, but usually these had the most kills out of any of my units in the battle, so this is the way that you kind of take out a lot of the enemy armies. So while Rohan are cavalry heavy, in practice it doesn't always work out like that. Sometimes they bring armies that have a lot of regular infantry, and in that case you want to be using your generals to counter that. So the units that you can get from the tier 1 and 2 barracks really aren't that strong. The Dunlanding fighters are the best you can get, and they only have a melee attack of 4 and total defense of 12, whereas your general units generally have slightly higher. So we go to Dara here, go to the veteran warriors, you've got total defense of 15 and melee attack of 5, and if you upgrade that, then that will help as well. So other points to note when fighting against Rohan is when you attack Helm's Deep, the 2 tower script will kick in and they will get a load of free units, which includes some really strong Galadrim units, just to reflect the elven units that came to their aid during the films. The elven units they get are elite sentinels, which are the Lothlorien elves can't even recruit that unit. It's a general's bodyguard unit, so it's an incredibly powerful unit. So you don't want to be giving those to Rohan for free. So try not to get into a situation where you attack Helm's Deep and then you can't take it and then you leave Rohan with all those units. If you're attacking Helm's Deep, you need to have at least a couple of stacks to deal with them in one turn. And then as you move across, I found the easiest way to deal with Rohan is just to have a couple of armies always together, going after each settlement, because usually one army on its own is not enough to deal with a stack from Rohan. Your units just are not powerful enough to deal with theirs, and there's not a huge amount you can really do about that, unless you've got a full stack of generals or something similar. But beyond that, it's worth going for a Gondor settlement at some point, because the Gondor variants of the Dunlandings are the best type of unit that you can recruit, so it's always worth going for one of those, and you can do that just by heading south, as long as you leave them enough time to actually build a forge. Another important point on this campaign is that in the absence of elite units, I feel like it's more important than ever to be upgrading the units you do have. So if you go into the building browser, you'll see that there's various upgrade buildings for heavy attack, missile attack, armor, and light attack. So these buildings do decrease your taxes, so you don't want to build them everywhere, but it's so important to just maximize the stats on the units you do have to give you a fighting chance against the enemy. So I would still build these in quite a lot of places. I mean, generally, money isn't a factor once you get past the 15 or 20 settlements anyway, so yeah, I would build these where you can. The other thing to note with these buildings is that you need a minor city to get the highest upgrade on the armor, and bearing in mind that most of your settlements start as either towns or large towns, it can take a bit of time to get there, and to counter that, there are a few settlements which start quite large. So Helm's Deep, for example, is a huge city, so straight away you can get all the upgrade buildings there, there's no restrictions on that. And then the bigger Rohan cities as well, so ones like Edras is a large city. So if the place is already quite a large settlement, then you can start building those upgrade buildings straight away, as opposed to having to wait until the town upgrades. Like, this settlement is only a town, so I can only get the first tier. But yeah, that's about it for the campaign strategy. If I was giving it a difficulty rating, it would probably be 5 out of 5 or 4 out of 5. But yeah, that's about all the things I picked up in my campaigns as the Dunland faction. So with that being said, I'm going to move on to the units. In this section, I'm going to run through the units on the battlefield. The interesting feature of the Dunlandings roster is that they use the military buildings of other factions to arm their own men. So, for example, you have the Gondor Spear version of the Dunlandings, or the Rohan Axe variant. In running through the units, I've grouped them up into their different types. So first we have the early game units, then we've got a range of different spears, next up is the regular infantry, and lastly there is some ranged options / special units. Firstly, we're going to cover the early game units, the bandits and the Dunlanding warband. Both of these are recruitable from tier 1 of the barracks, so they're pretty much the first units you get access to. The difference between them is that the Dunlanding warband come from regions which have hidden resource wild men, so this is effectively your native unit, whereas the bandits are the non-native unit. In terms of stats, the bandits are very weak, as you might expect, just the melee attack of 2 and defense of 6, so they're basically peasant units, and I wouldn't use them unless I had no other choice. The Dunlanding warband are slightly better in that they have an attack stat of 5, so they can at least do some damage, but then again, their defense is very low, so they're still very vulnerable to ranged fire. Another redeeming feature though is the high unit size of 200, which is huge. Generally, it's only orc nations which have unit sizes that high, but overall, they are your early game units, so you wouldn't be expecting much from them, and I'd be wanting to move on to the better units as fast as possible. Up next, we have the spear units, of which there are 6. 5 of these are recruitable from military buildings of other factions, and then the last one, being the bandit spearmen, is what you can recruit from the barracks in non-native regions. Firstly, we have the Uruk spear variant of the Dunlandings, which is essentially the men of Dunland arming themselves in Uruk armor. These are a special case when it comes to the different units in the roster, because of your 3 starting settlements, 2 of them actually begin with an Isengard smithy. which is the tier 1 Isengard Forge. So you can actually recruit these from turn 1 and get these straight away. And they are very useful because it's likely you're going to be fighting against Rohan if you're working towards victory objectives, and they are obviously a cavalry heavy nation, so spears are very important. And as you can get these right from the start of the game from 2 regions, I found myself recruiting a lot of these spearmen. In terms of the stats, they're not the best, but you just need spearmen in the early game, so if this is all you have access to, then you basically just have to use them. Having said that, the unit size of 180 is very good. Up next, we have the Rohan Spear variant of the Dunlandings. If you're playing towards your victory objectives and moving through Rohan, then this is probably the second spear unit you're going to have access to. So you would only really use it if it was better than the Uruk-hai spear, which you have access to at the start of the game. And in general, I'd say it's slightly worse. The unit size is a bit lower. The defense is -1, as is the melee attack. The only redeeming feature is that they do have a missile element to them. But I think if you're using spearmen, you're using them to hold the line. So I would put more emphasis on the unit size and defense, and the Uruk spear is better in that regard. So I would always use the Uruk spear over the Rohan spear. Up next, then, we have the Elvish spear variant of the Dunlandings. So this is the men of Dunland arming themselves in Elvish weapons and armor. In terms of stats, they are very similar to the Uruk spear. They just have +1 melee attack, so strictly speaking, they are better, but they are quite difficult to get because the closest places you could recruit these units is Lothlorien and Rivendell. And to get to Lothlorien, you have to basically defeat Rohan to get there. And then to get to Rivendell, you have to get through a bunch of bandit settlements, potentially the Free Peoples, and then Rivendell is quite a difficult siege. So they're not a unit that I went out my way to get, especially since the Uruk spears do just as good a job and you can get them right from your starting settlements anyway. But I think it's quite cool that they have implemented this feature where the men of Dunland arm themselves in other factions' armor, and it's a nice addition to have. Our penultimate spear unit is the Orc spear variant of the Dunlandings. Again, very similar to the Uruk spear. Like with a lot of the Forces of Evil variants, they are quite difficult to get because if you turn the diplomacy script on, you can't attack a fellow Forces of Evil faction. So the only way you'd be able to get this unit is if Mordor conquered a region, built a forge, it was then taken off them, and then you retook that settlement, and you'd be able to get this unit. But, stats are very much similar to what we've been seeing so far. There's no great disparity between this and the other spear units. Last but not least, we have the Gondor spear variant of the Dunlandings. In my opinion, the best spear unit you can get as Dunland. You can see the total defense of 16 towers above anything we've seen previously. Most of the other ones are hovering around 9 or 8, so this is noticeably above that. The melee attack of 3 is a bit lower than what we've previously seen, but I think if you're using spearmen, you favour the higher defense over high melee attack because you want them to hold line. They do have a slightly lower unit size at 160, but it's still fine. And especially with the higher defense, I think they'll be as effective or more effective than what we've seen before. So to recruit the Gondor spears, you need to conquer a region in which there is already a Gondor tier 1 forge. And you can do that fairly quickly in the campaign if you just head straight south. If you head south, capture a couple of the Rohan settlements, and then make your way through the pass in the mountains, then you'll come through in the west of Gondor. So you can get these fairly quickly, but just bear in mind you need to wait for Gondor to actually build the tier 1 forge. But yeah, the best spear unit in the roster in my opinion. So then we come on to the bulk of the roster, the regular infantry. The Dunland fighters are your native infantry units. These come from tier 2 of the barracks. In terms of stats, they're not brilliant. The melee attack of 4 is on par with a mid-tier unit from a faction like Gondor, and then the defense of 12 is definitely on the lower end. The unit size of 180 is good, like with a lot of the Dunland units, but I'd say you definitely want to be moving on to the stronger units in the roster as you move through your campaign. Next up, we have the Rohan Axe variant of the Dunlandings. So if you're playing your campaign towards victory objectives, which is to essentially defeat Rohan, then this is probably the second regular infantry unit you're going to have access to out of this selection here. In my opinion, this is better than the Dunland Fighters, which is the unit we just looked at, because it has better defense, similar melee attack, and it also has a missile element to it. So as soon as you can pick up this unit, should be fairly early in the campaign. I would always recruit this over the Dunland Fighters. Up next, we have the first of two Elvish variants for regular infantry. We have the dual-wielding Sylvan Blades. As I was saying with the Elvish Spears, it would take quite a while to get these in your campaign because you'd have to go to Lothlorien or Rivendell, and they're not necessarily that much better than everything else that would sort of incentivize you to go out your way to get them. As they are dual wielding, they do have naturally low defense because they don't carry a shield, and as you might expect, their melee attack of 6 is pretty good, but you pay for that with the decrease in defense. It's not really a unit I use much in my campaigns. I think the dual wielding units or the one-handed units which don't have shields are not really suitable to make up the front line. If you are using this kind of unit, you need to be using it as a flanker to bring in from the side to do a bit of damage, otherwise they're just going to get ripped to shreds by missile fire. But they do have some utility in the campaign. Up next then we have the second of those elven units, the Elven Swords. You can get these from tier 2 of an Elven Forge. In terms of their stats, it's very similar to what we've seen before. Their defense is on the lower end just because they don't carry a shield, and their melee attack of 6 combined with the high charge stat of 7 means they can actually do quite a bit of damage, but like with the Sylvan Blade, I wouldn't go out my way to recruit this Elven unit. Now we move on to the Gondor variant of the Dunlanding, the Gondor Sword. In my opinion, this is the best regular infantry unit you can get. This is, if you're playing a campaign, this is the unit that you want to make up the bulk of your front line. Like with the spears, it's got great defense of 17, which is relatively good defense for 17, which is better than almost everything else you'll see in the roster. The melee attack of 4 is not brilliant, but considering the high defense, I'm more than willing to live with an attack stat of 4, and then it retains that fairly high unit size of 160. So an all-round great unit in this roster, and I would definitely be going for those Gondor settlements when you can to be able to recruit this unit. Just bear in mind that it only comes from tier 2 of the Gondor Forge, and that can take Gondor a while to build up to in some of their more remote settlements. So just bear in mind you need to give them a bit of time to actually get there before you take the settlement. Then we have the only Dwarvish variant in the roster, the Dwarvish Axe variant of the Dunlandings. This is actually a pretty powerful unit, even though it's a two-handed unit and it doesn't have a shield. It still has relatively high defense of 12, owing to that high armor stat of 6. The melee attack of 5 is probably above average, and then it's also got a missile element to it as well, with a missile attack of 13, which is also quite respectable. So these are a great all-round unit. The only slight downside is the relatively low unit size of 140, which, if you look through the roster, is one of the lowest. But a nice addition to the roster, a great all-rounder, I would say. The only other point I would make on this unit is, again, it's quite difficult to get this unit because you need to conquer somewhere that already has a Dwarven Forge. And even though you start close to the Misty Mountains, the city of Moria is owned by the Orc rabble, so you can't capture that if you have diplomacy turned on. And then you'd have to go a bit further north to find somewhere else. Outside of that, you'd have to go to the edges of the map to Erebor or to Eredluin. So it's a difficult unit to get. Not something I would go out of my way to get, but a nice addition to the roster nonetheless. So up next then we have 3 variants that come from evil factions. We have the Uruk swords, the Orc axe, and the Baltrot axe or the Easterling axe. So as I was saying before with the Orc spear, it's quite difficult to be in a situation where you'd have access to these units because you can't attack a fellow forces of evil faction if you have the diplomacy script turned on. So in most cases, you'd either need to retake a settlement they lost, or them to capture a settlement, lose it, and then retake it. So I will go through them in terms of stats, but just bear in mind it's probably unlikely you'd be in a situation where you'd ever have access to them. So first up we have the Uruk swords. These are essentially quite similar to the Dunlanding fighters, but just better, or slightly better in each aspect. Slightly improved defense, melee attack, and morale. And they still retain the high unit size of 180, so a decent all-rounder. Up next we have the Orc axe variant of the Dunlandings. So again, these are a 2-handed unit, total defense of 10 and melee attack of 5. Very similar to what we've seen before with the Elven swords, for example. Then last but not least, we have the Easterling variant of the Dunlandings with their very distinctive plate armour. The feature which sets this unit apart is it's one of the only units in the roster which has an armor-piercing primary weapon. Combined with the melee attack of 5 and relatively high charge stat of 6, this unit can definitely do a lot of damage. But like with a lot of the 2-handed units, the relatively low defense leaves them vulnerable to missile fire. Up next then, we've got some ranged units as well as the Warhounds. So like with the bandits right at the start, I wouldn't use the bandit scouts as my skirmishers. I would always use the Dunlanding scouts just because they have slightly higher missile attack and ammo. The Dunlanding scouts are your primary range unit during the campaign. They don't have the best stats to be honest, but they are really all you've got access to. And if you can get them upgraded, they can still do a lot of damage. I routinely used armies where I'd line up with a line of spears and then just put these Dunlanding scouts behind, and they would regularly rack up hundreds of kills. So definitely a unit with utility. Then we have the Warhounds. This is effectively the cavalry equivalent for the Dunlandings. This is the unit they can recruit if there is a horse resource in a region. As with the base game, I've never found Warhound units to be all that useful. You can use them to pin enemies down effectively and try and keep them out of fight, but I've never had that much success with them. Then lastly, I just wanted to cover the Free Riders. So these aren't in the original army that I put together because I didn't have enough slots, but during the campaign, you don't have access to any cavalry units from your military buildings. So the only way you can get cavalry is to pick up mercenaries, and these tend to be the ones that are in the vicinity at the start of the game, or your starting area. So I can't bring up the stats, but in general they're very weak cavalry, but you can use them for chasing down enemy units. The problem when you don't have cavalry is that you can win battles, but then half the enemy army gets away because they just run off the battlefield and you've got no way to catch them and chase them down. But having at least one unit of these Free Riders means that can't happen, so you can regularly rack up hundreds of kills just by chasing enemy units down, but they're not really strong enough to use for flanking. That's going to be it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one.